The Raven at Rook's Hollow. Holmes in the shadows. It was a typical evening in London, the fog wrapping itself around the city like a thick, impenetrable veil. I could barely make out the shape of the street lamps as they flickered dimly through the mist, casting long shadows on the cobblestones. Chapter 1. The chill in the air was biting, enough to make one grateful for the warmth of a fire. But even the comfort of a hearth couldn't quell the strange feeling that had taken root in my chest that evening. I arrived at our quarters on Baker Street, only to find the door ajar. I frowned at this oddity. Holmes was always precise, and the door was never left unlocked. As I pushed it open, I felt a peculiar sense of anticipation, as though something was about to unfold. Inside, the familiar scent of pipe smoke and old books greeted me. But there was something more, an electric tension in the air, as though Holmes had been waiting for this moment all day. I stepped into the sitting room, my boots clicking softly against the wooden floor. Holmes was there, as expected, but his attention was elsewhere. He sat in his usual armchair, the violin resting untouched on his lap, and his eyes were fixed on the window. The firelight flickered off the edges of his face, casting a strange, almost ghostly glow. Despite the stillness of the scene, there was an energy about him, a subtle restlessness that spoke of a mind always at work. "Holmes," I said, breaking the silence, "I wasn't expecting you to be so preoccupied this evening." He did not immediately respond, his eyes narrowing slightly as he stared through the fog outside. Then, in his usual quiet manner, he spoke. "Ah, Watson, you've come just in time. I believe our evening is about to take an intriguing turn." I set down my coat and hat, scanning the room for any indication of what he meant. Something in his voice had struck me. There was a sharpness to it, a quiet excitement that was unlike his usual detached demeanor. My curiosity was piqued, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of his gaze as he continued to study the mist beyond the window. "Holmes, what is it? What's happened?" I asked, stepping closer, sensing that something was not quite right. Holmes turned his eyes to me, his gaze piercing as always. "The Raven at Rook's Hollow," he said, his voice low and almost reverent, as though the name itself held a certain ominous weight. "Rook's Hollow," I repeated, utterly confused. "I don't recognize the name. Where's this place?" "A village, a day's journey or so from here," Holmes replied, standing slowly and moving toward the fireplace. He absent-mindedly adjusted his coat, as if lost in thought. "It is not a place one hears of often. A small, quiet hollow tucked away from the world. The sort of place one might forget exists until something extraordinary happens." I waited for him to elaborate, but he seemed content to let the silence linger, as if savoring my curiosity. Finally, I could take the tension no longer. "Is this something we need to investigate?" I asked, my tone careful. "Are people in danger?" Holmes' lips curled into a subtle smile, the kind that usually signaled he had uncovered a thread of the mystery no one else had seen. "Ah, Watson, you are ever perceptive. Yes, there have been disappearances, several in fact, that seem to lead back to Rook's Hollow. But it is not the disappearances themselves that concern me so much as the manner in which they occur." I tilted my head, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "How so?" Holmes moved to the table and retrieved a small bundle of papers, which he unfurled before me. I could see the neat handwriting, though it was mostly illegible at first glance due to the crude scrawls and hurried lines. Holmes studied it briefly before looking up, his eyes flashing with a cold gleam. "A young woman named Evelyn Grange disappeared just yesterday," he continued, "and what makes her case so particularly interesting is that she vanished from a locked room, no window open, no door ajar. There was no sign of forced entry, nothing but a single raven's feather left behind, tucked neatly under the door. I paused, my mind racing. A locked room disappearance was already enough to raise my suspicions, but the addition of the raven's feather unsettled me further. A raven's feather? I asked slowly, the bizarre image hanging in the air. What could that possibly mean? Holmes raised a hand, as though to silence my growing doubts. The feather is not simply a clue, it is a symbol, Watson. A symbol of death, of transition. A message, if you will, left for us to decode. Why leave such a peculiar mark? Because to mine something far older than our modern sensibilities. I crossed the room and stood beside him, feeling the weight of his words settle in my chest. But why? Why would anyone leave such a thing? What is the connection? Holmes took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing in thought. That is what we must find out. I believe the feather is not the only clue. There is something hidden in Rook's Hollow, something buried beneath its quaint exterior, something that has been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And now, with this disappearance, it seems that moment has arrived. I couldn't help but feel a chill crawl down my spine at the mention of something buried within the hollow. It was as if Holmes had glimpsed a shadow lurking just beyond the edges of the world I knew, and he was determined to expose it. So, where do we begin? I asked, trying to steady my nerves. It was clear that this was no ordinary case. There was something far darker at play, and I was caught in its grip along with Holmes. We will visit Rook's Hollow at once, Holmes replied, his voice steady and resolute. I suspect that the villagers have not been forthcoming with the truth, and I intend to remedy that. We must understand why Evelyn Grange vanished, and why the raven's feather was left behind. The answer, I believe, lies within the heart of that hollow. I nodded, though unease gnawed at me. I knew better than to question Holmes' judgment, but something about this case tugged at me in ways I could not yet explain. There was an air of menace around it, like a storm on the horizon that would soon break. Holmes rose, gathering his coat and adjusting the familiar deerstalker cap that seemed to be as much a part of him as his mind itself. I did the same, though I couldn't shake the sense that this journey would take us places far darker than I could have ever imagined. Come, Watson, Holmes said, a gleam in his eyes. The game is afoot, and I dare say, this time we may uncover something far greater than a mere case of disappearance. As we stepped out into the cold night, the fog wrapped around us like an invisible hand. It felt as though the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And as Holmes and I made our way toward the unknown, I realized, with a growing sense of dread, that whatever awaited us in Rook's Hollow, it would change everything. The Raven at Rook's Hollow. The Whispering Hollow. The journey to Rook's Hollow took us several hours, with Holmes insisting we traveled by carriage to avoid any unwanted attention. The fog, thick as a blanket, seemed to grow heavier the further we went from London. Streets grew quieter, and the oppressive stillness made the night feel colder, almost unnatural. We passed through sleepy villages, their lights flickering in the distance like fireflies in the dark. Each village seemed more desolate than the last, and the quietness of it all gnawed at me. I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone lurking just beyond the fog. Holmes, however, remained unaffected, his mind clearly absorbed in the task at hand. Holmes, what do you make of this? I asked after some time, breaking the silence. These disappearances, they don't seem to follow any discernible pattern. Are we dealing with a series of isolated incidents, or something more orchestrated? Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with neat, meticulous writing. He scanned the pages for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. It is indeed an unusual case, he mused, but not one without its patterns. You see, Watson, the disappearances all follow the same sequence. The victim sift They are, indeed, victims disappear without warning. From homes, from locked rooms, from places where no one could possibly enter or exit unnoticed. And each time, there is the same singular clue left behind a raven's feather, delicately placed, as though with intent. I leaned forward, intrigued. But why the feather? What purpose does it serve? Holmes closed the notebook with a snap, his eyes meeting mine. My dear Watson, is the crux of the mystery. You see, a raven is often associated with omens, death, mystery, and secrets buried in the shadows. But its role in this case, I suspect, is more than symbolic. Whoever is behind these disappearances is sending a message. The question is, what is the message, and why target this particular village? I nodded, turning the matter over in my mind. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Rook's Hollow, a small village nestled deep within the countryside, was an isolated place. If the disappearances were intentional, they had to have some purpose. The raven's feather, almost theatrical in its choice, seemed like a deliberate clue. But who would go to such lengths, and for what reason? After several more miles of bumpy road, the carriage slowed to a halt. We had arrived. The village of Rook's Hollow looked even more desolate than I had imagined. The fog clung to the houses, their dark windows staring out like hollow eyes, empty and uninviting. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying wood. There was no sign of life, no movement, except for the faint rustle of the trees in the distance. It was as though time had frozen in this place. Holmes stepped out first, his coat fluttering slightly in the wind as he surveyed the surroundings with keen eyes. He seemed almost at home in this oppressive atmosphere, his stance firm, his gaze sharp. I followed suit, pulling my coat tighter against the cold. "We should begin at the house where Miss Evelyn Grange disappeared," Holmes said, his voice cutting through the silence. "I suspect that the circumstances of her disappearance may hold more significance than we realize." We made our way through the village, the path growing narrower and more overgrown with each step. The cottages that lined the road were small and unkempt, their gardens overrun with weeds. It was a far cry from the bustling streets of London, and a stark contrast made the air feel even heavier. As we approached the Grange family home, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle in my chest. The house was a modest two-story structure, its wooden frame weathered with age. It sat at the edge of the village, a lonely sentinel amidst the trees. The front door was slightly ajar, and the faintest trace of light filtered through the cracks in the shutters. Holmes, ever the observant one, took in the details of the house with a single glance. High A's darted over the uneven steps, the slightly crooked roofline, and the worn path leading to the door. He seemed to make a mental note of everything, his mind already working on the case before we had even stepped inside. "Come along, Watson," he said, his voice steady. "We must see the scene for ourselves." I nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the darkened windows. As we entered the house, the air grew even colder. The interior was modestly furnished, but the feeling of abandonment was palpable. A faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, but it was overshadowed by the stale, musty atmosphere of the place. We made our way up the narrow staircase, where Holmes immediately took to examining the room where Miss Grange had last been seen. It was a small bedroom, sparsely furnished. The bed was neatly made, and the floorboards creaked underfoot as I moved across the room. Holmes, however, seemed uninterested in the decor. His attention fixated on the smallest of details, the faint imprint on the floor where the rug had been moved, teared in the curtains, and most notably, the absence of the door's lock, which had been removed entirely. "This is troubling," Holmes muttered to himself, crouching to inspect the floor. "It seems that someone or something has been here before us." I joined him at his side, my eyes scanning the room. I could see no sign of struggle, no indication that Miss Grange had fought to escape. It was as though she had simply vanished, as if the room had swallowed her whole. And yet, Holmes continued, the absence of the lock is perhaps the most telling sign. Someone wanted this room to be open, accessible. They did not want any barrier between themselves and Miss Grange. I glanced back at the door, noting how odd it was that it had been left unlocked. Even in this small, seemingly quiet village, it seemed out of place, almost too convenient. Holmes stood slowly, his sharp eyes scanning every corner of the room before he moved toward the window. He opened the shutters, just a crack, and I saw him examining the outside carefully. His mind was already piecing together the puzzle. "Holmes," I asked, my voice breaking through his thoughts, "what do you believe happened here?" Holmes turned to face me, a thoughtful expression on his face. "I believe Miss Grange's disappearance was orchestrated. Whoever is behind it wanted us to find the clues they left behind. The raven's feather, the absence of the lock hall part of the game." I could feel the unease creeping back into my chest. I had no doubt that Holmes was right. We're being led somewhere, but where and why? "We will need to speak with the villagers," Holmes said, his gaze narrowing. "I suspect that someone here knows more than they are willing to tell." As we left the room, I cast one last glance over the bed, now a symbol of the mystery that awaited us. We had come for answers, but already, it seemed, we had stumbled into a web of secrets much deeper than we had anticipated. The hollow itself, it seemed, was whispering its silence, thick with meaning, its shadows holding more than just the darkness of night. Chapter 2, The Raven at Rook's Hollow, The Shadow in the Village. The village of Rook's Hollow felt even more unnerving as we ventured deeper into its winding streets. The air, still thick with fog, seemed to cling to everything: trees, fences, buildings. The stillness was pervasive, a sense that time itself had slowed down, as if the village were caught in a moment that it would not let go of. The oppressive silence made it difficult to concentrate, and I found myself glancing around, expecting to see someone watching from behind the closed shutters of the cottages we passed. Holmes, however, moved with his usual purpose, his eyes sharp, scanning every detail. It was as if the village, in its unnerving quietness, had become a puzzle he was eager to solve. He barely acknowledged my presence as we walked, his mind already a million miles ahead of me. The only time he spoke was when he asked me to make note of something: an unusual footmark in the mud, a faint outline in the mist, a door ajar where it shouldn't be. "Holmes," I ventured, after a few moments of walking in silence, "do you think the villagers know more than they are letting on? There is something strange about their reluctance to speak, even when I made inquiries before we arrived." Holmes's gaze flickered to me for a moment before he answered, his voice low and deliberate. "Indeed, Watson. Hey, there is a certain tension in the air here, a fear that lingers beneath the surface. It is as though the villagers are bound by something they dare not speak of. But what that is, I cannot yet say." We had reached the center of the village now, the houses becoming even more sparse, their foundations crumbling in the dampness of the land. The village square, if it could be called such, was little more than a few scattered buildings and a large, ancient stone well at the center. A few villagers milled about, their faces weathered, their eyes avoiding ours. As we approached, they seemed to have an air of quiet resignation, as if they knew something they would never share. It was not distrust they held toward us, it was something darker, something deeper. Holmes's sharp eyes caught the slightest movement from one of the villagers, a woman standing near the well, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. She watched us with an intensity that made me pause, as though she were trying to decide whether to flee or speak. "We shall begin there," Holmes said abruptly, his gaze fixed on the woman. We started toward her, with the ease of someone accustomed to navigating uncomfortable situations, leaving me to catch up. The woman's eyes flickered nervously as we approached. She was older than I first imagined, her face lined with age and worry, but there was something about her that made her seem even more aged than she was. Her hands were clenched tightly at her sides, and her mouth was set in a thin line. She knew something, that much was obvious, but whether she would share it with us was another matter entirely. "Good evening, madam," Holmes greeted her with his usual calm but penetrating tone. "I hope we are not disturbing you." She gave a slight nod, but her eyes never met ours. "No, sir," she replied softly. "What brings you to Rook's Hollow?" Holmes studied her for a moment, noting the subtle nervousness in her posture. "We are investigating the disappearance of Miss Evelyn Grange," he said plainly. "I believe you may have information that could be helpful." At the mention of Miss Grange, the woman's face hardened and her eyes shifted away. It was the slightest movement, but I saw it, the shift in her demeanor, the flicker of something deep beneath the surface. Holmes, however, seemed undeterred. "Miss Grange's disappearance," Holmes continued, "is part of a series of unsettling events in this village. We are simply trying to understand why this is happening and what role, if any, this village plays in it." The woman inhaled sharply, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them tighter together. Her gaze remained firmly fixed on the ground, as though the very act of looking at us would give something away. "I cannot speak of it," she muttered, her voice strained. I don't know what you think you'll find here. There's nothing for you to know." "Nothing," Holmes repeated, leaning closer, his voice soft yet insistent. "Tell me, madame, do you believe this is simply a coincidence? Do you not see the pattern? The raven's feathers, the vanishing, the whispers in the dark." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. "You know something. I can see it in your eyes." For a long moment, there was only the faint rustling of the fog around us, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Then, at last, the woman's shoulders sagged, and she raised her eyes to meet Holmes's gaze. I don't know how much I can say," she said, her voice breaking. "But you're right. Something's wrong in this village. It's not just the disappearances, there's the shadows that come with them. There are things here, things we don't talk about, we're afraid to." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly, but his expression remained calm. "What things? What is it you fear, madam? The woman looked around nervously before leaning closer, lowering her voice. "The ravens, sir. They're not just birds. They've been coming for weeks now, every evening. And sometimes, when the fog is thick enough, you hear them whispering. They come for the ones they've marked. And when they're gone, we find the feathers. Always the feathers, never the bodies." A shiver ran down my spine at her words. The ravens, the whispering. It all sounded like superstition, but there was something in her tone, something that made me question my initial skepticism. Holmes, ever the skeptic himself, didn't immediately react. Instead, he took a step back, his gaze turning toward the sky, scanning the thick fog above us. "The ravens," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Do they ever appear at the same time each night?" The woman nodded, her face pale. "Always around midnight. But it's not just the ravens. There are rumors, strange stories about them. Old well in the center of the village. People say it's cursed, that it's been here longer than anyone can remember. That something unnatural lurks beneath it." Holmes straightened, his expression one of deep concentration. "A cursed well, you say?" he repeated. "Interesting. And what do these rumors say about this entity?" The woman shook her head slowly, as if to ward off some unseen fear. "No one knows for sure, but the ravens, the disappearances, they all seem to point back to it. Something terrible has been awakened in this village, and it's not something you can fight with logic, sir." Holmes regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, madam. You've been most helpful. I suggest you take care. The fog grows thicker, and we may yet learn more about this village's secrets." As we turned to leave, I couldn't help but feel that the ground beneath our feet was shifting towards something far darker than I had ever imagined. The woman's words lingered in my mind, and the idea of a cursed well of ravens whispering in the fog seemed more than just superstition now. It was a mystery one that we were only beginning to unravel. As we walked back toward the center of the village, I glanced over my shoulder at the woman. She was already retreating into the shadows, disappearing into the fog, as though she were one of the many specters haunting this forsaken place. "What do you think, Holmes?" I asked, unable to suppress the unease gnawing at me. Holmes didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the distant silhouette of the old well, standing like a monument in the center of the square. It was hard to tell whether he saw a clue or a threat, but I had no doubt that he was already devising a plan. "I think, Holmes," said at last, his voice calm and measured, "that we are very close, Watson. Very close indeed." And with that, the fog seemed to grow even thicker, as if it were pulling us toward the heart of the mystery, toward the well. The raven at Rook's Hollow. The depths beneath the next morning brought little clarity, though it did bring a sense of foreboding that settled like a heavy cloud over Rook's Hollow. The village had hardly stirred by the time we began our investigation, as though it was still shrouded in the deep, unnatural stillness of the fog. I had hoped that a full night's rest would bring a sense of resolution to the mystery, but instead, the growing unease seemed only to deepen, like a slow poison that seeped through the very fabric of the village. Holmes, as always, was up at the crack of dawn, his mind already racing with possibilities as he paced the small room we had secured in one of the village's few inns. I could tell from his expression that the night had not brought him any peace, but I also knew that he rarely found rest until the case had been solved. "Watson," Holmes said as I entered the room, his voice cutting through the silence, "I have been thinking about the woman we spoke to yesterday. What she said about the ravens there is something about it that lingers with me. She described them as though they were not merely birds, but agents of something far more sinister." I sat down across from him, my own mind clouded with the same questions. The raven's feather left at the scene of each disappearance was, as Holmes had suggested, no simple clue. It was something much more a symbol of death, a forewarning. But why had they been left, and who or what was sending them? "You believe the ravens themselves are more than mere birds, don't you?" I asked, unsure if I was even prepared for the answer I might receive. Holmes's eyes, sharp as ever, met mine. "Indeed. I believe they are connected to whatever force has taken hold of this village." The woman spoke of them in such a way that I cannot dismiss her words as mere superstition. "There is something behind them, something deliberate." His voice was filled with quiet conviction, and though I could not explain it, I felt an unease creep up my spine as I looked out the window at the mist-covered landscape. The village was still, silent, almost too quiet. There was no sound of morning activity, no birds, no children playing. It was as though Rook's Hollow were suspended in time, caught in a trance. "We need to learn more about the well, Holmes," continued, his eyes narrowing. "The woman's mention of it, the rumors surrounding it, everything points to that well. If the ravens are a part of something darker, something bound to this place, then the well may be the key to unlocking it." I nodded, although a part of me recoiled at the thought. There was something about the idea of the well old, deep, and cursed that unsettled me. But Holmes was never one to shy away from a mystery, no matter how dark it may be. And if he believed the well was at the heart of the mystery, then I knew I had no choice but to follow him. We made our way to the village square once again, the fog thickening with every step we took. The ancient stone well stood at the center, its worn edges covered in ivy and moss. It was a relic of some forgotten time, its surface pitted and eroded by years of neglect. But despite its age, it seemed almost alive. The air around it hummed with a strange energy, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as we approached. Holmes stood before the well, his eyes scanning it with the same intensity he reserved for only the most perplexing of cases. He knelt down, inspecting the stonework with an almost reverential touch, his fingers tracing the ancient carvings that lined the edge. I watched him, a mixture of awe and apprehension growing within me. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "this, well, is far older than it appears. I would hazard a guess that it predates the village itself." I leaned in to inspect the carvings closer, and sure enough, they appeared to be of a style I had never seen before. Strange, cryptic symbols etched into the stone, their meanings obscured by time. It was as if they had been deliberately hidden, waiting for someone to decipher them. "There's something wrong about this place," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. "I can feel it." Holmes gave me a sideways glance, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Watson, I too sense it, but we cannot allow ourselves to be swayed by fear or superstition. We must uncover the truth." He stood up and began to circle the well, his eyes scanning the surrounding area for any additional clues. His movements were fluid, almost as if he were drawn to something I could not see. I followed him at a distance, unwilling to take my eyes off the well for too long. As we walked around the well, Holmes paused at one particular point. There, lying on the ground, was a small bundle of raven's feathers, arranged in a careful pattern. My stomach dropped at the sight. These were not the ordinary feathers we had found before. They were larger, more vivid, almost as though they had been placed with intent. Holmes crouched down to examine them, his eyes narrowing. "Interesting," he murmured. "It seems the ravens have left us another clue. But why here? Why this?" "Well," I looked at him, puzzled. "Do you think these feathers are connected to the well?" Holmes stood, his gaze fixed on the well as if he were staring straight through it. "I do. I believe these feathers are not just markers of death. They are symbols, markers of something far older, something that this village has been guarding for centuries." I shuddered at his words, but I had no time to dwell on the thought. Holmes's expression had shifted from one of quiet contemplation to one of intense concentration. Without another word, he turned on his heel and began walking toward the edge of the village, his footsteps purposeful and quick. "Holmes, where are you going?" Kay called after him, quickening my pace to catch up. Kay didn't answer immediately, his mind clearly focused on something ahead. After a moment, he stopped abruptly in front of one of the village's few remaining cottages, its windows dark and shuttered. The house was old, its walls sagging with age, but what struck me was the strange energy that seemed to emanate from it, a heaviness, a presence that felt wrong. "This is where it began," Holmes said, his voice low and steady. "The first disappearance, the first feather. I believe the answers lie within these walls." My heart raced as I looked up at the cottage, an inexplicable dread settling over me. There was something about it that made me hesitate, as though stepping inside would be crossing some unspoken boundary. But Holmes, as ever, had already moved to the door, his hand outstretched. Without a word, he pushed it open, and we stepped into the dark interior. The air inside was thick with dust, and the faint smell of damp earth lingered. I squinted in the dim light, trying to make sense of the room around me. It was sparsely furnished, with only a few pieces of worn furniture scattered about. But as I stepped further inside, I caught sight of something that made my blood run. Cold on the floor, just beneath the window, was a single raven's feather. though it had been placed deliberately in plain sight. Holmes moved to the feather, his expression grim. "The pattern is becoming clearer, Watson. This house is more than just the site of a disappearance, is the heart of the mystery." I stood frozen, the weight of his words settling over me. We had crossed the threshold, and now there was no turning back. The truth, whatever it was waiting for us. Chapter 3. The Raven at Rook's Hollow. Whispers beneath the floorboards. The atmosphere inside the cottage grew heavier as we ventured further into the dimly lit room. The air was thick with the smell of must, and the walls seemed to close in around us as though the house itself were holding its breath. Holmes moved quietly, his sharp eyes scanning every corner, every object. The raven's feather that lay beneath the window felt like an ominous invitation, one that we had no choice but to accept. I crouched beside it, reaching out to pick it up. As my fingers brushed the soft, dark plumage, a sudden chill ran through me, an inexplicable sense of foreboding that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I could feel something beneath the surface, as though this feather was a key to unlocking something far darker than I had anticipated. Holmes, ever the one to resist jumping to conclusions, was already moving to the far corner of the room. His eyes flicked over a cracked wooden floorboard, and without hesitation, he knelt down to inspect it more closely. "Watson," he said, his voice low, "take a look at this." I stepped over to where he knelt, noticing the faint grooves in the wood that indicated it had been disturbed. The floorboard had been lifted before, and it seemed as though something had been hidden beneath it. Holmes's fingers, nimble and precise, began to pry it up. The creaking of the floorboards seemed louder in the silence of the room, the sound unsettling in its quietness. With a sharp tug, the board came loose, revealing a small, dark cavity beneath. Holmes peered into it for a moment, his face unreadable, before he reached in and pulled out an object. My heart skipped a beat as he held it up for me to see. It was a small, intricately carved wooden box, its surface worn from years of neglect. The carvings were delicate, almost ethereal, and they seemed to shimmer in the dim light. For a moment, I could not place their meaning, but there was something about them that set my mind on edge. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked, my voice tight with curiosity. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he carefully examined the box, running his fingers over the carvings. He seemed to be lost in thought for a moment before he finally spoke. "This box," he said quietly, "was likely hidden here for a reason. The symbols, do you recognize them?" I studied the carvings more closely. They were faint, but unmistakably a combination of geometric shapes and curving lines that seemed to form an ancient, almost ritualistic pattern. I felt a chill run through me as I stared at them. But it wasn't until I noticed a faint, scratched inscription along the bottom of the box that my heart began to race. "For the Raven's mark," I read aloud, the words catching in my throat. Holmes's gaze darkened as he looked at the inscription. "That is significant, very significant. It seems that whoever is behind these disappearances is not simply marking victims with feathers. They are part of something far older, something tied to this village's past." I felt a wave of unease wash over me. "Do you think this box has been here for centuries? How could it possibly be connected to the ravens?" Holmes stood slowly, his eyes never leaving the box. "I suspect the box is a relic, a part of some ritual or some force that has been dormant for a long time. The ravens are the messengers, and this," he tapped the box gently, "is the key to understanding what is happening here." I looked around the room as if expecting the walls themselves to hold the answers. The atmosphere had grown even heavier since we had entered the cottage, and the sense of something dark lurking just beneath the surface seemed to intensify. The raven's feather, the symbols on the box, the strange whispering in the villagette was all connected. But to what end? Without another word, Holmes slipped the box into his coat, his expression resolute. "We must find out where this box came from, Watson. It's clear that it is tied to the larger mystery, but the question remains, what is its purpose?" We left the cottage quickly, the oppressive atmosphere seeming to press in on us as we stepped back into the village square. The fog had thickened even further, and I could hardly make out the shapes of the few villagers who still lingered about. They moved with a quiet urgency, avoiding our gaze as we passed. Holmes seemed undeterred, his mind clearly focused on the box in his possession. He walked with purpose, his footsteps steady, despite the weight of the mystery hanging over us. As we reached the village's edge, Holmes stopped suddenly, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the fog-choked horizon. "I believe we need to speak with someone who may have more knowledge of this village's history," he said, turning to face me. "There is a man who may be able to help. His name is Old Tom. He lives on the outskirts of the village, near the cemetery." "Old Tom," I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "And what makes you think he would know anything about this?" Holmes's lips twitched into a small, knowing smile. "It's not so much what he knows, Watson, but what he has seen. He is one of the few who remembers the old stories, the ones that have been buried beneath layers of time. If anyone can shed light on the strange happenings here, it will be him." With that, we made our way to the edge of the village, our destination clear but shrouded in mystery. As we walked through the thickening fog, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though I could see no one. It was as if the very land was watching us, waiting to see what we would do next. The journey to Old Tom's house was brief, though no less unsettling. The village gradually faded away behind us as we moved into the outskirts, where the buildings grew sparser and the trees closed in around us. The air was colder here, and the ground beneath our feet seemed to squelch with every step. At last, we reached a small, weathered cottage nestled against the base of a hill. A wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, and a faint light glowed from the windows. It seemed like a place forgotten by time, as if it were suspended in the past, and I felt the weight of its isolation as we approached. Holmes knocked on the door with a firm but deliberate motion. For a long moment, there was silence, and then, from inside, I heard the slow shuffle of footsteps. The door creaked open, and there stood a man of at least 70, his face deeply lined with age, and his eyes sharp despite the years. He was dressed in a long, threadbare coat, and his hair, once dark, was now a silvery white. "You're here about the ravens, aren't you?" Old Tom asked before we could speak. Holmes nodded, his expression serious. "We are. We need to know what you can tell us about the history of this village and about the ravens." Old Tom's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and something else, something older, something that had long been buried. "Come in," he muttered, stepping aside to let us pass. As we crossed the threshold, the air grew colder still, and I could feel a sense of anticipation hanging heavy in the room. Whatever Old Tom had to say, I knew it would take us one step closer to the heart of the mystery, okay? But I also knew that, with each step, the danger we faced would only grow more real. The Raven at Rook's Hollow. The keeper's secrets. Old Tom's cottage was as much a relic of the past as the village itself. The moment we stepped inside, I felt the weight of history pressing down on us. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood and aged parchment. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls, where strange symbols were scrawled in the dim light. Shelves laden with worn books and dusty trinkets lined the walls, and the room felt as though it had not changed in decades. Time seemed to have stopped here, as if the world outside had forgotten this place, leaving Old Tom to stand guard over secrets no one else dared to remember. He led us into the main room, where a rickety wooden table stood, covered with maps, old documents, and peculiar objects. It was clear that Old Tom was not just a simple villager, but someone with a deep knowledge of the past. His eyes, though clouded with age, retained a sharpness that made me uneasy. It was as though he could see through the very walls of his cottage to the hidden truths that lay beyond. Without a word, he motioned for us to sit at the table, his hands trembling as he arranged a few of the papers before him. Holmes took the seat closest to the fire, his eyes never leaving old Tom, while I sat across from him, my mind racing with questions. "You're here about the ravens," old Tom said again, his voice gravelly and low. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, one that carried an eerie certainty. Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Yes, we are. But we also need to understand more about this village's history. The disappearances, the feathers, what is it that binds them all together?" Old Tom looked at Holmes for a long moment, his eyes flicking toward the flickering flames before returning to meet our gaze. "Shh, Hollow," he began, his voice soft, almost reverent, is not like other places. It was built on ancient ground, long before any of us came here. The land, it has a memory. It remembers things that we cannot see, things that we can hardly imagine. I glanced at Holmes, but he remained silent, allowing old Tom to speak. The old man continued, his voice dropping even lower, as if he were about to share something forbidden. "The ravens, they are not just birds. They are messengers, yes, but of something far older. Something that has been here, buried beneath the earth, for centuries. The well," he paused, looking at us with a haunted expression. "The well is where it all begins. It's not just a well, it's a doorway, a threshold. It has been here since the village was founded, and it's been waiting." Chill crept up my spine as the words settled in the room. A doorway? To what? The questions swirled in my mind, but I dared not interrupt. "You see," old Tom continued, "there was a time, long before the village took root here, when the land was inhabited by something else. It was said to be a force of nature, old as the earth itself. A Pete was not something to be worshipped, it was something to be feared. The ravens were its eyes, its spies. They watched the land, and when they returned to the hollow, it meant that the force was near." I felt a shiver run through me as I processed the old man's words. "You're suggesting that this force, thing's still here?" I asked, my voice betraying a mix of disbelief and dread. Old Tom nodded slowly. "I don't know what it is, but I know it's real. I've seen it myself. The ravens don't come for nothing. They come for those who are chosen, those who the land claims." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Chosen? What do you mean by that?" Old Tom's gaze dropped to the table, and for a moment I thought he might not answer. But then he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "The land has its own way of selecting who it will claim. It marks them, just as it has marked the ones who have disappeared. It is not just the ravens that carry the mark. There are symbols, old symbols, that are left behind. And when the mark is placed, there is no escaping it. The chosen must return to the land." I could feel a heavy silence settling over the room. It was as though old Tom had opened a door into a world I wasn't prepared to understand. And now I could see the shadows beyond it. Holmes was as still as a statue, processing the information, and I could tell from his expression that he was beginning to piece together the larger puzzle. "Are you saying the ravens are a warning?" I asked, my voice a little shaky, despite my attempts to remain composed. "They are the messengers," old Tom replied. "And when they arrive, it means the time has come. Something or someone must return. The ravens are the key to understanding who or what that is." I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me. The notion that this ancient force still lingered in the shadows of Rook's Hollow was more than unsettling. It was terrifying. But Holmes, ever the skeptic, did not seem shaken. "Tell me, old Tom," Holmes said, his voice steady. "What Do you know about the symbols? Where can we find them? Okay. Old Tom hesitated, his eyes darting around the room, as if expecting something or someone to be listening. There are carvings, he said finally. Not just in the well, but all around the village. In the old churchyard, in the trees by the river, even in the cottages themselves. The symbols are everywhere, but they've been covered up, erased by those who knew better than to let them be seen. If you know where to look, you'll find them. Holmes's eyes gleamed with an intensity I hadn't seen before. Then we must look. We cannot afford to waste any time. The disappearances have only just begun, and the ravens will continue to come. But we must understand what they want, what they're guarding before it's too late. Old Tom leaned back in his chair, a look of resignation settling over him. You'll never find it all. The land's secrets are buried too deep. But if you insist on digging into the past, be prepared. The truth may be more than you can bear. Psst. His words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. It was as though Old Tom knew something we did not, and he was trying, in his own way, to warn us away from the path we had chosen. But it was too late. We were already too deep in the mystery, and there was no turning back. Holmes stood abruptly, his mind clearly racing. We will find these symbols, Watson. And when we do, we will uncover the truth behind these disappearances and the force that has claimed this village. I stood as well, though a part of me felt the weight of dread settled over me like a thick cloak. There was something ancient, something unknowable, lurking in Rook's Hollow, and we were being drawn toward it. Every step we took seemed to lead us further into the darkness, but I knew that we had no choice but to continue. We had crossed the threshold, and now there was no turning back. Section 7. The Raven at Rook's Hollow. The Whispering Trees. The afternoon sun had barely pierced the fog when Holmes and I set off to search the village for the hidden symbols Old Tom had spoken of. Despite the unsettling nature of the revelations we had just uncovered, there was a sense of resolve in Holmes's demeanor. His mind was already at work, shifting through the information, considering the possibilities, and plotting our next move. I, on the other hand, felt a nagging sense of unease, as though we were standing on the edge of something far darker than we could fully comprehend. We began our search at the churchyard, a place Old Tom had mentioned as one of the locations where the symbols could be found. It was an ancient site, with crumbling tombstones leaning at odd angles, their inscriptions worn away by time. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The trees around the graveyard twisted and gnarled, as though they had grown in protest of the passing years. The fog, ever present, hung low in the air, creating an oppressive atmosphere that made the entire place feel like a mausoleum. Holmes, with his usual efficiency, moved with purpose, his keen eyes scanning the weathered stones and the overgrown paths. I followed closely behind, my steps muffled by the thick carpet of moss that covered the ground. The silence in the graveyard was almost unbearable, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a raven, which seemed to echo in the distance, though no birds were visible. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Here." He had crouched down before an old gravestone, its surface eroded almost beyond recognition. At first glance, it seemed like an ordinary marker, a relic of some forgotten soul. But upon closer inspection, I saw that the stone was not entirely smooth. There, barely visible under the layers of grime and moss, were faint carving symbols that seemed strangely familiar, though I couldn't place where I had seen them before. I knelt beside Holmes, my fingers brushing the cold stone as I studied the carvings more closely. There were spirals, curved lines, and jagged edges, all intertwining in an intricate pattern. It reminded me of the symbols I had seen on the box we found in Old Tom's cottage cryptic, ancient and unsettling. "These are the symbols," I said quietly, more to myself than to Holmes. The ones old Tom spoke of. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. Indeed, and I believe they are more than mere decoration. These symbols are part of the ritual, part of whatever force has been awakened here. I looked around the graveyard, feeling a growing sense of unease. But what are they for? What do they mean? Holmes stood, wiping his hands on his coat as he surveyed the graveyard. I suspect we will find more of them, Watson. These symbols are not just here. They are scattered throughout the village, hidden in plain sight. We must look for patterns, for connections. Only then will we begin to understand the full extent of what we are dealing with. We spent the next few hours combing the graveyard, searching for any additional symbols hidden among the tombstones. As we worked, the fog grew thicker and the light began to fade, casting long, eerie shadows across the land. Despite our thorough search, we found no more carvings, and I began to feel a sense of futility creep in. Perhaps old Tom had been mistaken, or perhaps these symbols were simply lost to time. But then, as we reached the farthest corner of the graveyard, we came across a cluster of ancient trees, their trunks twisted and contorted into unnatural shapes. Cute, the trees seemed to have grown together, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy that blocked out the light. The air around them was thick with the smell of earth and rot, and I felt a strange unease settle over me as I stepped closer. Holmes, however, was undeterred. He moved toward the trees with purpose, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. I followed, my steps slower, wary of the strange energy that seemed to radiate from the place as we neared the center of the cluster. I saw what had drawn Holmes's attention. In the trunk of one of the trees was another carving. This one, far more distinct than the ones we had seen before. This symbol was larger, more elaborate, and more defined. It was a circle, with jagged lines radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. In the center of the circle was an intricate, swirling design that seemed to shift and move, as if the symbol itself were alive. It was both beautiful and terrifying, and I could not shake the feeling that it held some terrible power. Holmes crouched beside the tree, his fingers tracing the carving with delicate precision. "This," he said softly, "is the key. This symbol is the heart of the mystery." I stood behind him, my heart racing as I stared at the design. "What does it mean, Holmes? What does it signify?" Holmes looked up at me, his face grim. "I believe this symbol is a mark of power, okay? A marker of something ancient, something that binds this village to a force far older than we can comprehend. This symbol, like the ravens, is a messenger of warning." I felt a shiver run down my spine at his words. A warning of what? What was this force that had been awakened, and what did it want? Holmes stood up slowly, his gaze fixed on the symbol. "The ravens are the messengers, Watson, but this," he pointed to the symbol on the tree, "is the source. This is the mark of the thing that calls them." I could see the resolve in Holmes's eyes as he turned away from the tree and began walking back toward the village. He was already thinking ahead, already piecing together the next steps of the investigation. But I, too, felt a sense of urgency growing inside me. We were close now, closer than we had ever been, but the answers we sought were still shrouded in darkness. "We must find the well," Holmes said suddenly, his voice steady. "The well is where it all began, and it is where it must end. We've uncovered the symbols. Cool, but we must learn more about this foursome, on what it wants, and how it is connected to the ravens." I nodded, though my mind was swirling with questions. It was standing at the edge of something far greater than a simple mystery. We had uncovered a dark and ancient truth, and now we had to face it. As we made our way back to the village, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The fog seemed to close in around us, the trees whispering in the wind as if they knew what was coming. Whatever lay ahead, it would not be something we could solve with logic alone. We were on the precipice of something far darker, and the only way forward was into the heart of Rook's Hollow itself. Section 8. The Raven at Rook's Hollow. Beneath the well, as Holmes and I walked back toward the village. The mist had grown thicker, and the faint light of the setting sun barely filtered through the oppressive fog. The landscape around us seemed to distort and shift, as though the world itself were closing in, tightening its grip. Each step seemed to carry us deeper into the mystery, pulling us inexorably toward the heart of Rook's Hollow. The symbol we had discovered on the tree still lingered in my mind. Its intricate, swirling lines seemed to burn themselves into my thoughts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us, waiting for something. Holmes, however, walked with purpose, his mind already at work, piecing together the puzzle. Key. It was as if the mystery had revealed itself to him in a way that I could not yet fully comprehend. "We're getting closer, Watson," Holmes said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. "The well is the key. We must return to it." I nodded, my throat dry, but I couldn't quite rid myself of the sense of dread that had settled over me. Since we had uncovered the symbol, the well was no longer just a forgotten relic. It was the center of everything. The place where the forces we were chasing had taken root. The place where the past, the present, and whatever lurked in the shadows of this village all converged. As we reached the village square, I noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The streets were empty now, the houses shrouded in silence, their windows dark. There was no sound, no movement, only the faint whisper of the wind through the trees, and the ever-present call of the ravens, distant but constant. It was as if the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Holmes led the way to the well, his pace steady, and I followed closely behind, my senses heightened. The closer we got, the more the air seemed to thicken, as though the ground beneath our feet was pulsing with some unseen energy. The well, looming in the center of the square, appeared even more foreboding in the deepening fog. The ancient stone structure seemed to have a presence, as if it were watching us, waiting for us to approach. Holmes stopped at the edge of the well, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. Stood beside him, my eyes fixed on the dark, gaping hole that seemed to descend endlessly into the earth. The air around the well felt colder, and I could almost feel the weight of centuries pressing down on us. Whatever lay beneath, whatever had been sealed away for so long, was now stirring. Holmes crouched beside the well, his gaze intent on the stonework. I could see him tracing the familiar symbols with his eyes, his mind calculating, deciphering, pulling the threads of the mystery together. His hand reached down, brushing over the surface of the stone. I saw his fingers linger for a moment, as if he were feeling for something that I couldn't see. "There's something here," he muttered, more to himself than to me. His voice was almost reverent, and I could hear the excitement building in his tone. I knew it. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you mean, Holmes? What's here?" Holmes looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with the intensity of discovery. "It's the symbols we've been seeing, the ones in the churchyard, on the tree are connected to this well. It is not just a physical structure. It is a symbol in itself, a gateway, a threshold. A threshold to what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Holmes's expression grew darker. "A threshold to whatever force has been awakened in this village. Whatever ancient power is tied to these symbols. The ravens are messengers, yes, but they are not the only means of communication. This, well, is a conduit, a way to channel the power that is buried beneath Rook's Hollow." I felt a chill crawl down my spine as the weight of his words settled in. The well was not just a source of mystery, was the source, the epicenter of everything that had been happening in the village. The disappearances, the symbols, the ravens, they were all part of something much larger, something ancient and malevolent. Holmes stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on the well. He seemed to be lost in thought, his mind racing with deductions. I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes as he worked through the problem. His fingers twitched as if he were about to take some action, but he hesitated for a moment. "We need to go down," Holmes said suddenly, his voice firm. "Answers are beneath us. We have to see for ourselves." I stared at him, my mind racing. "You want to go down into the well?" The idea of descending into that dark, seemingly bottomless pit filled me with an unease I couldn't quite explain. It felt wrong and natural. "You don't have a choice, Watson," Holmes replied, his gaze unwavering. "The well holds the answers. Everything points to it." Reluctantly, I nodded. There was no denying the urgency in Holmes's voice. If we were to uncover the truth, we had to go deeper, quite literally. I had trusted Holmes in countless investigations, and I could not allow fear to stand in the way now. Holmes's keen eyes darted around the square, his mind already calculating the best approach. "We'll need a rope," he said, scanning the area. "There's no other way down. We'll descend into the well and search for whatever lies beneath." I looked around, hoping for some sign of a ladder or a way to descend, but the well was old, too old, and its stone walls were slick with moisture. There were no obvious means of access. Holmes, however, was already moving toward one of the nearby cottages, his quick stride carrying him across the square with purpose. I followed, my steps hesitant but determined. We had no time to waste. We soon found the cottage where we could acquire a length of rope. The villagers had long since abandoned most of their possessions, leaving little behind but the remnants of their lives. Yet, in the back of one cottage, we found a sturdy coil of rope, likely used for some forgotten purpose. Holmes tested it with a practiced hand, nodding in approval before tying one end securely around the nearby post. "You first, Watson," Holmes said, his voice steady. I swallowed hard, but obeyed, taking a deep breath before beginning my descent. The rope was cold and rough against my hands, but I gritted my teeth and slowly, carefully, lowered myself into the dark depths of the well. The sound of my feet scraping against the stone seemed amplified in the stillness, and the air grew colder. As I descended further, I could hear Holmes's voice from above, distant but clear. "Be careful, Watson. We're getting closer." As I descended into the well, I felt a deep unease settle in my chest. What awaited us at the bottom? Secrets had been buried here for centuries, and how would they change everything we thought we knew about Rook's Hollow? Section 9. The Raven at Rook's Hollow. The depths awakened the descent into the well seemed endless. With each handhold, I could feel the rough stone biting into my skin, the air growing colder as I sank deeper into the earth. The rope swayed slightly beneath me, the only sound in the heavy silence. It felt as though the darkness had swallowed me whole. And each moment I spent in that claustrophobic descent only deepened the growing sense of foreboding. I couldn't help but wonder what awaited at the bottom. What had Holmes seen that made him so sure this well was the key to everything? What truth had been buried here, locked away from the world for centuries? My thoughts were interrupted by the faint scraping of the rope against the stone, the noise growing louder as I neared the bottom. Finally, my feet found solid ground. I steadied myself, feeling the tension in my muscles ease slightly, though the dread that had settled over me remained. I looked up to see Holmes's face, above his form a shadow against the dimming light. His voice reached me, firm and confident, even in the oppressive stillness. "Are you all right, Watson?" "Yes," I replied, my voice a little hoarse. "I'm down. The ground feels solid." "Good," Holmes responded. "I'll follow." I barely had time to register his words before I heard him begin his own descent. The rope creaked, and I turned my attention back to the dark cavern below me. I was standing in a narrow chamber, the walls damp and slick with moisture. The faintest smell of earth and decay lingered in the air, mixing with something else, something distant, almost metallic. A low hum vibrated through the ground, subtle but undeniable. Holmes's descent was swift, and before long, he was beside me. I could see the faint glint of his eyes in the dim light as he surveyed the surroundings, his mind already processing the information. "Remarkable," Holmes said quietly. "The well has led us to a subterranean chamber, likely formed naturally over time. But the markings on the walls, these are no accident." I followed his gaze, my heart skipping a beat. On the stone walls, barely visible in the dim light, were carvings, more symbols. These were different from the ones we had seen in the village, more intricate and spread out across the walls. They seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as though they were alive, shifting in the shadows. Holmes stepped forward, his fingers brushing lightly over the carvings. "These symbols, these are the key," he murmured. "They represent a connection to something much older, something beyond the ravens and the well. Force, perhaps, that has been dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken." I took a hesitant step forward, my eyes scanning the walls. The symbols seemed to move, flickering in the dark like shadows that danced just beyond reach. There was something unsettling about their fluidity, as if the symbols themselves were aware of our presence, responding to us. "This place," I whispered. "It feels alive, as though it's breathing." Holmes's voice cut through the tension. "It is not the well that is the true source of this power. Is what has been sealed within the earth beneath us. This chamber. These symbols, they are part of a much older ritual, one that binds the land and the ravens to this place." I shuddered at the thought. "A ritual?" I asked, barely able to form the words. What kind of ritual could tie a force like this to the land? Holmes didn't immediately respond. Kay continued to study the symbols, his brow furrowed in concentration. Kay could see the way his mind was working, following the invisible threads of logic that had always led him to the truth, no matter how dark or dangerous. "I believe," Holmes said at last, his voice low, "that this place, this chamber, is used to channel or force something from beyond our understanding. It was sealed away long ago, perhaps by the founders of Rook's Hollow, but something has disturbed it. The ravens, the disappearances, the symbols, they are all part of the awakening." The idea of an ancient force locked away beneath the earth sent a shiver down my spine. It was as though we had crossed a threshold into a world where the rules of reality no longer applied. The things we had once thought were mere superstition were real land. They were waking up. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he studied the chamber. There must be more to this. It's a reason why the symbols are here, a reason why they're linked to the ravens. We need to find the source, Watson, the heart of this power. I nodded, though my mind was racing with questions I couldn't yet answer. "What do you think it wants, Holmes? Why has it chosen this village?" Holmes didn't respond immediately. He was too absorbed in his surroundings, his eyes darting from one symbol to another, his mind clearly working through the puzzle. The silence grew heavy between us, and the low hum of the chamber seemed to grow louder, vibrating in the air around us. Then, without warning, Holmes stepped forward, his fingers tracing one of the symbols on the wall. As his hand made contact, there was a sudden shift in the air tremor, subtle at first, then more pronounced. The ground beneath us seemed to shake, and a deep, resonant sound echoed through the chamber, as though something vast and ancient were stirring. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. "Holmes, what did you do?" Holmes's face was unreadable, his hand still resting on the symbol. "I believe I've activated something, perhaps something we shouldn't have. But there is no turning back now." The chamber trembled again, more violently this time. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift, their lines twisting and contorting, and the ground beneath our feet rumbled as though it were alive. A cold wind rushed through the chamber, carrying with it a whisper of voice distant but clear. It was a whisper that seemed to come from all directions, reverberating through the very walls of the chamber. Couldn't understand the words, but there was an unmistakable feeling in the air, feeling that whatever had been awakened, it was aware of our presence. Holmes stepped back from the wall, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and concern. "We've triggered something, Watson. Something that cannot be ignored." I looked around, my mind racing. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse in time with the sound, and the air grew colder, thicker, as if the very atmosphere were being drawn into the chamber. "We need to leave," I said, my voice tight with fear. Now, but Holmes didn't move. His eyes were locked on the center of the chamber, where the symbols converged in a swirling pattern that seemed to shimmer in the darkness. "No, Watson," he said, his voice steady, almost hypnotic. "We must see this through. The answers lie ahead. We've come this far." I took a step toward him, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I reached out, the ground beneath us shook once more, and the chamber seemed to split open, a crack forming in the stone floor. The darkness below us seemed to reach up, as though the very earth were trying to swallow us whole. Section 10. The Raven at Rook's Hollow. Into the abyss, the crack in the stone floor widened beneath our feet, the dark fissures swallowing the light. A cold gust of air, thick with the scent of earth and decay, swept through the chamber, sending a shiver down my spine. The whispering that had filled the air grew louder, almost deafening. And though I couldn't make out the words, I felt their pulling, inescapable call, a beckoning that sent a deep tremor through my bones. Holmes stood unmoving, his eyes fixed on the fissure in the ground, as if he was studying it, understanding it in a way I could not yet fathom. His expression was one of intense focus, his mind working through the unknown with a sense of purpose that left me in awe. "Holmes, we need to leave," I said, my voice strained, almost pleading. The ground felt unstable beneath us, the very air charged with a sense of danger that made my heart race. "Whatever's happening here, we can't just stay," Holmes did. "Not move." He didn't even look at me. His gaze was fixed on the deepening crack in the stone floor, and for a moment, I feared he had lost touch with everything except the enigma in front of him. "Holmes," I called again, but this time my voice cracked with a mixture of fear and desperation. He finally turned, his eyes meeting mine, and, for the first time, saw the flicker of uncertainty in his usually unwavering gaze. "We can't leave yet, Watson," he said, his voice steady but low, like the calm before a storm. "This is no mere coincidence. Everything, the ravens, the symbols, the whispers, it's all connected to this place. We're standing on the precipice of something that has been buried for centuries. To leave now would mean turning our backs on the truth." I swallowed hard, my heart hammering in my chest. His words, though logical and precise, offered no comfort. The very earth beneath us felt as though it were alive, pulling us deeper into its mystery. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to disobey Holmes. We had come this far together, and there was no turning back now. Before I could respond, the ground beneath us trembled once more, sending a jolt of fear through my limbs. The crack in the floor continued to widen, and I could see, faintly at first, a dark, swirling mass beneath the stone, a swirling abyss that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Holmes stepped closer to the fissure, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight. "Do you see it, Watson?" he said, his voice low, almost reverent. "That is the source. That is what has been buried beneath this land." I could barely make out the shapes below, their contours shifting and undulating, as though the very fabric of the earth were alive with an ancient force. The air around us was heavier than it had been before, but not with the same oppressive weight that had once pressed on us in the chamber below. It felt like the village was waking from a long, uneasy dream, its breath steadying the earth beneath, our feet settling into stillness. The fog that had once enveloped the village in a suffocating shroud had started to dissipate, thinning out with the first light of dawn. The once imposing walls of mist were now retreating like a veil lifted from the land, revealing the village in its raw, untouched state. The streets, though still eerily quiet, seemed less foreboding now. I could almost hear the whisper of life returning to the buildings, the faint creak of doors opening, the rustle of curtains being drawn aside. It was a subtle change, but it was there. As we reached the surface and stepped onto the ground above, I took a deep breath, the air now carrying a new freshness. It wasn't the damp, cloying atmosphere that had hung around the village for so long. The atmosphere felt cleaner, less oppressive. And though the lingering dread of what we had faced remained in the back of my mind, there was also a sense of resolution. The darkness we had fought, that ancient force that had tormented Rook's Hollow for centuries, was gone. And in its place, there was silence. Holmes stood beside me, his gaze fixed on the rising sun as it began to pierce through the last of the mist. There was no triumph in his expression, no feeling of victory. Instead, his face wore the calm of someone who had seen the worst of what the world could offer and had faced it head on. It was not a look of satisfaction, but of necessity. He had done what needed to be done, and now the rest of the world could move forward. I suppose that's it, I said quietly, trying to process the enormity of what had just transpired. The village is safe now. Holmes turned to me, his face unreadable as always. Yes, but what does that really mean, Watson? What we faced in that chamber was not just a force of nature. It was something more, a relic, a remnant of a time long forgotten. Its influence is gone now, but the land, it will bear the scars. This village will never be the same. I nodded, knowing that Holmes's words were true. Even though the immediate danger had passed, the memories of the horrors we had uncovered would linger. The people of Rook's Hollow would rebuild, of course, but they would never forget what had happened in the dark chambers beneath their feet. We should check on the villagers, I suggested, my voice low. Make sure they're safe. They may not even know what happened beneath their feet. Holmes hesitated for a moment before giving a short nod. You're right. But I doubt they'll remember much of what occurred. The influence of the force was subtle, insidious, okay? It seeped into their lives without them even realizing it. It's possible they won't recall the events in any meaningful way. We made our way through the village, our footsteps muted by the thick fog that still lingered near the ground. As we passed the homes, I noticed that the windows, once dark and shuttered, were now open, allowing the fresh air to sweep inside. The few villagers we saw walking about looked confused but unharmed. They moved slowly, as though waking from a long sleep, their eyes blinking against the morning light. It didn't take long for us to reach the town square, where the heart of the village's darkness stood in the center. Now that it was empty, it seemed less foreboding, almost like a forgotten relic. Its stone walls, which had once been the source of so much fear, now stood in quiet resignation, as though relieved of the burden they had carried for centuries. The crack that had once threatened to swallow the village was gone, sealed tight, just as the dark force below had been sealed away. Holmes paused in front of the well, his gaze fixed on it. I could see the thoughtfulness in his eyes as he considered the implications of what we had done. The well will never be the same, he said quietly, almost to himself. Okay, it's no longer a threshold, but a memory. The force has been contained, but its legacy will remain. The ravens may no longer come, but something in this place has changed. I watched Holmes for a moment before glancing around at the village again. The air felt lighter, the mist dispersing completely as the sun began to rise higher, casting golden light across the quiet streets. It was a new day, and the village seemed to be waking up from its long, dark slumber. We should leave, Holmes said after a long pause, his voice calm but final. Rook's Hollow is safe now, but we've done all we can here. There is nothing more to uncover. I nodded, although a part of me wanted to stay and watch to see how the village would change in the coming days. There were still many questions left unanswered, many mysteries that we would never truly understand. But Holmes was right. We had done what we came to do. The darkness was gone, and the villagers would rebuild, unaware of the battle that had been fought beneath their feet. We made our way back toward the edge of the village, our steps slow but purposeful. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the land. The birds, silent for so long, were now returning to the trees, their calls echoing across the village in a welcome return to normalcy. As we reached the edge of Rook's Hollow, I turned to look back one last time. The village, bathed in the early light of day, looked peaceful, now remarkable. Even the mist had cleared, and the land felt alive again. Whatever had once held it captive was gone, and the village would, in time, forget. But as Holmes and I walked away, heading back toward the road that would take us home, I couldn't help but wonder what lay beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary place. What other secrets might remain buried, waiting for the next curious soul to uncover them. Do you think it's truly over, Holmes? I asked, breaking the silence. He didn't answer immediately, and for a moment I thought he hadn't heard me. But then, in his usual quiet way, he spoke. "Nothing is ever truly over, Watson," he said softly. "Some mysteries remain, even when they've been solved. But this one has been sealed away. For now." We walked in silence for a few more moments before Holmes turned to me, his eyes glinting with that familiar, unreadable expression. "But who knows," he added, almost with a touch of amusement in his voice. "Perhaps one day someone else will come seeking answers. And when they do, they may uncover something even darker than what we faced." I glanced at him, half smiling, despite the unease that still lingered. I wouldn't be surprised. And with that, we continued on our way, the village of Rook's Hollow fading into the distance behind us, a place both saved and forever changed by the dark history we had unearthed. Section 14. The Raven at Rook's Hollow. The road ahead. The journey out of Rook's Hollow was quieter than I expected. The village, now bathed in the soft, golden glow of the morning sun, seemed to be at peace. The air, once thick with the oppressive weight of the unknown, now felt fresh clean. It was as though the land itself had breathed a sigh of relief, exhaling the last remnants of the darkness that had once held it captive. As we walked along the path, Holmes and I did not speak for several moments. The silence was not uncomfortable, but heavy with thought. Each of us had experienced something in Rook's Hollow that would stay with us long after we left. The memories of the chamber beneath the well, the dark power we had encountered, the knowledge that we had altered the course of the village's fate. They would not easily fade. I glanced at Holmes, his figure moving ahead with purpose. But there was a slight tension in his posture that hadn't been there before. For all his brilliance, all his confidence, I knew that the weight of what had transpired was still with him. It was the same for me, though perhaps less obvious. I had been swept up in the whirlwind of the mystery, caught in the depths of what we had faced, and now that it was over, I found myself wrestling with a strange emptiness, a sense of loss, as though the journey itself had consumed something within me. "Holmes," I ventured, my voice breaking the quiet, "do you think we truly understood it all? The force we faced, the power that was beneath the well. Do you believe we have sealed it away for good?" Holmes paused, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He didn't turn to face me, but his words came, measured and deliberate. "We did what we had to, Watson. The ritual was completed, and the force was contained. But we cannot know everything. Not yet. There are some things that even I cannot predict. Then, what was it? I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. That force, that darkness. What was it really? Why did it target Rook's Hollow? Holmes took a deep breath, his eyes still fixed ahead. It was not targeting the village, Watson. It was targeting something else, perhaps the land itself, or the people. It was an ancient power bound to this place for reasons long forgotten. We may never know exactly what it was. It might have been a remnant of something older, something that preceded even the village itself. I pondered his words. The idea that the darkness had been tied to something older, something beyond the boundaries of the village, unsettled me. Okay, what had once been there, hidden beneath the earth for so long? Okay, what had we really released, and what might still remain in the shadows? Then, we've only scratched the surface, I muttered, more to myself than to Holmes. He nodded slowly. Perhaps, but what we've done is enough for now. The ritual, the binding it, has secured this land. The ravens will no longer come. The disappearances will cease. But Rook's Hollow will remain marked. It is part of its history now, and that is something it can never escape. As we continued on the road out of the village, the weight of Holmes's words hung heavy in the air between us. The village had been freed from the immediate threat, but it was clear that its past, whatever had happened beneath the surface, whatever had awakened would continue to haunt it. The land had been marked, and the scars would remain, even if the people forgot. It was then that I noticed something else. The village, despite the seeming peace, was still strangely quiet. The villagers, though awake and moving about their daily lives, appeared disconnected, distant, even. They seemed as though they were waking from a long, unsettling dream, uncertain of what had transpired, yet somehow aware that something had changed. But none of them seemed able to grasp the true depth of what had happened beneath their feet. It's almost as though they don't know, I said, my voice trailing off. Holmes glanced at me, his expression unreadable. That is the nature of things, Watson. There are forces at work in this world that most people cannot comprehend. They can feel the change. They know something is different, but they cannot see the truth of it. We are the ones who carry that knowledge now, and it is our burden to bear. I thought about his words for a moment. Holmes was right. Of course, the villagers would never know the full extent of what had occurred. They would go on with their lives, and perhaps the memory of the well of the ravens would fade over time. But we would remember. We would carry the knowledge of what we had faced and what we had done. As we reached the outskirts of the village, the road stretching before us, I felt a shift in the air. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The fog, once so thick it seemed to smother everything, had completely lifted. The sun, now higher in the sky, bathed the land in light. The road ahead was clear, and for the first time in days, the world felt wide open. Do you ever wonder, Holmes, I asked, my voice softer now, if we're meant to uncover these secrets, if the mysteries we solve are part of something larger? Holmes's gaze drifted to the horizon, his eyes distant, his thoughts elsewhere. Perhaps, Watson, or perhaps we are simply wanderers, drawn to places where the veil is thinner, where the shadows are closer. The mysteries we encounter are part of the world we live in. It is only our duty to bring the light. We continued walking in silence for a while, the road before us stretching out in the distance. I couldn't help but feel that, despite the sense of resolution, something lingered, something unfinished. The feeling that we had left a part of ourselves behind in Rook's Hollow was inescapable. I think we'll be back someday, I said quietly, more to myself than to Holmes. Holmes didn't respond immediately. Okay, he continued walking, his eyes never leaving the path ahead. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke. Perhaps, but it is not our time yet. For now, we move forward. There are always more mysteries to uncover. More truths to discover. Rook's Hollow will remain, but the road ahead calls to us. I didn't answer. I simply nodded, knowing in that moment that Holmes was right. We had completed this chapter, but the journey was far from over. As we left the village behind, I glanced over my shoulder, watching the last of the fog melt away in the warmth of the sun. Rook's Hollow was behind us now, but the memories of the ravens, the well, the darkness would remain. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that someday, when the time was right, we would return to uncover the next layer of the mystery that lay hidden beneath the surface of the world. For now, though, we walked on. The road ahead was long, and the mysteries it held were waiting. Section 15. The Raven at Rook's Hollow. Beyond the horizon, the road stretched endlessly before us, a ribbon of dirt and gravel that seemed to lead to nowhere and everywhere at once. The quiet of the morning, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, wrapped around us like a cocoon. The sun, now fully risen, cast long shadows on the path, and the air felt warm and fresh, a sharp contrast to the heavy atmosphere we had left behind in Rook's Hollow. I glanced over at Holmes, his face unreadable as always, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, something that told me he was, too, processing the enormity of what we had just done. We had confronted something ancient, something beyond the scope of human understanding. The village, for all its apparent peace, was forever marked by the darkness we had uncovered and sealed away. The whispers that had once haunted the air, the ravens that had circled above, were gone. But the land itself still felt different, faintly unsettled, as though we were still coming to terms with the power that had been released and contained. Holmes, I ventured after a few minutes of walking in silence, do you think the villagers will ever truly understand what happened, what we did? Holmes didn't answer immediately. His eyes were focused ahead, but his mind was clearly elsewhere, navigating through the complexities of the mystery we had solved. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet and thoughtful. No, Watson, they won't. The power we faced, the darkness beneath the villages, beyond their comprehension. And perhaps that's for the best. Some truths, once uncovered, can change a person irrevocably. It's better that they live in peace, unaware of the forces that once threatened them. I couldn't help but wonder if Holmes was referring to himself as well. He had always carried the weight of the mysteries he solved with a calm detachment, but I had seen the toll it took on him, especially with something as profound as what we had faced in Rook's Hollow. Even now, though his demeanor was as composed as ever, I could sense a slight heaviness in his movements. As we continued down the road, the village behind us fading into the mist, I felt a strange sense of finality settle over me. The puzzle had been solved, the mystery had been uncovered, and the darkness had been sealed away. Yet, a part of me felt as though the story wasn't truly over, not entirely. The road ahead was long, and I knew that our journey, though we had finished with Rook's Hollow, was far from complete. We've done something remarkable, haven't we? Said, the thought coming out before I could fully process it. Holmes glanced at me, his eyes narrowing slightly in that way he always did when something intrigued him. Remarkable, Watson. His voice was soft, almost contemplative. I suppose one could call it that. But it's also something far more complex. We did not just uncover a mystery. We confronted a fossil remnant of something far older. And in doing so, we disturbed the very fabric of a place, of an entire village. I could see the weight of his words and the way his gaze lingered on the path ahead. There will always be consequences, Watson. We may have sealed the darkness away for now, but we can't forget the truth of what we faced. That kind of power doesn't simply vanish. It lingers. His words resonated with me. I had known from the moment we descended into that well that we weren't just solving a mystery. We were facing something deeply rooted in the very heart of the land itself. What we had done, while necessary, wasn't just about preserving the villagette, was about confronting an ancient power that had slumbered for far too long. And what now, Holmes? I asked, my voice quieter than usual. What happens after all of this? Holmes didn't look at me, but I could sense that he was considering my question carefully. Watson, we move forward. The road ahead is always full of mysteries, some seen, some unseen. There will always be questions that need answering. But as for Rook's Hollow, it will heal. The people will go on with their lives, never knowing the full extent of what we've uncovered. I felt a sense of finality in his words, but also an unspoken understanding between us. We had done what needed to be done, and now we had to continue on our separate journeys. It was strange to think about leaving Rook's Hollow behind, to close the chapter on something so immense, so dark, but that was the nature of our work. It was never about staying with one story for too long. It was about moving forward, seeking out the next mystery, the next truth to uncover. And yet, as we walked, the thought lingered in my mind, what would become of Rook's Hollow? Would the land truly heal, or would the scars of the past remain beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered again? There was something unsettling about the idea that a place could be changed so profoundly, yet continue as though nothing had happened. Do you ever wonder, Holmes? I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me again. If we'll ever return to places like Rook's Hollow, if we'll ever be called back to uncover the mysteries we left behind. Holmes's lips twitched slightly, the ghost of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Perhaps, Watson, perhaps we will. The world is full of forgotten places, full of hidden stories. We may not always know when we're needed, but I'm certain we will be called again. That is the nature of our work. I felt a sudden sense of peace at his words, a quiet reassurance that despite everything we had just gone through, there would always be more mysteries, more stories to uncover. We would always be needed, and in some strange way, that thought gave me comfort. As we continued walking, the village of Rook's Hollow now behind us, I began to see the world through a different lens. Its bug had lifted, both literally and figuratively, and the path ahead seemed clearer. The road was open, and no matter what lay ahead, I knew that as long as Holmes and I continued our work, there would always be something more to discover. The first few hours of our journey passed in comfortable silence, the kind that only companions who have seen much together can share. The landscape around us began to change, rolling hills giving way to flat stretches of farmland, its fields stretching endlessly into the distance. It was a peaceful scene, and yet, as I looked out across the open land, I couldn't help but feel that the world still held more secrets, more mysteries waiting to be discovered. Holmes was still quiet beside me, his pace unhurried, his eyes always scanning the horizon. The road ahead was long, but it was a road we both knew well. It was the road of discovery, of truth, of chasing shadows until they could be brought into the light. So, Watson, Holmes said, breaking the silence, his tone light, almost teasing. Have you figured out where we're headed next? I smiled, the sense of adventure returning to my chest. I'm sure you have a destination in mind, Holmes, but I'm content to follow your lead. Holmes turned to me with a rare smile, his eyes glinting with mischief. Then let us see where the road takes us, my friend. The world is wide, and there are many more mysteries waiting for us to solve. With that, we continued down the road, the village of Rook's Hollow fading further into the distance, and the adventure ahead of us unfolding like a new chapter in a story that had only just begun.